The boy was 7 years old when his father sold him to the temple. Not as punishment, not as slavery, as an honor. In 3rd century BCE Athens, the temple of Aphrodite had a special requirement. They needed boys, young boys, boys who would never become men. The priests called them hierokosmoi, sacred ornaments. What they actually were was something far more disturbing. The transaction happened at dawn. The father received payment equivalent to 3 years of income, enough to save his failing farm, feed his other children, keep his family from starvation. The boy didn't understand what was happening when the priests led him through the marble corridors, past the towering statue of the goddess, into a small chamber that smelled of incense and something else. Something metallic. 4 priests held him down on a stone table. No explanation, no ceremony, just efficiency. The cut took seconds. The screaming lasted for hours. They used a curved bronze blade, heated until it glowed. The cauterization happened immediately, searing flesh to prevent bleeding out. The boy's body went into shock from the pain. He vomited until there was nothing left. His vision went white, then black, then white again. Through it all, the priests chanted prayers to Aphrodite, asking the goddess to bless this offering, to make him pure, to prepare him for sacred service. Sacred service, that's what they called it. When the boy finally stopped screaming, reduced to whimpering sobs, the head priest leaned close. His breath smelled of wine and rot. He whispered that the boy was now blessed, that he had been given the greatest gift, freedom from the base desires that plagued ordinary men. He would serve the gods themselves. He would be trained in the mysteries. He would bring pleasure to those who walked closest to the divine. The boy didn't understand. He was 7 years old and had just been mutilated. Understanding would come later. Horror would come even sooner. They kept him in the recovery chamber for 6 weeks. Other boys were there too, some younger, some older, all recently castrated, all crying. Some died from infection. Their bodies were removed quietly in the night. The priests never mentioned them again. The surviving boys learned their first lesson quickly. Don't ask questions. Don't make trouble. Don't show weakness. By the time the boy could walk again, his entire world had been reduced to the temple walls. He would never see his family again. The priests explained this matter-of-factly. He belonged to the goddess now. His old life was over. His new purpose was about to begin. But the physical mutilation was just the beginning of his transformation. The boy's real training started on his 8th birthday. They moved him from the recovery chambers to the education wing. 10 other boys were already there, ranging from ages 7 to 12. All castrated, all terrified, all being prepared for something the priests called divine service. The head instructor was a eunuch named Cleomenes. He had been castrated at the temple 20 years earlier. Now he was in his 30s, his body soft and hairless, his voice high and strange. He smiled constantly. The boys learned to fear that smile. Cleomenes explained the curriculum on the first day: physical training, flexibility exercises, dance, music, and what he called the arts of pleasing. He never used explicit words. He didn't need to. The demonstrations made everything clear. The boys were taught to move gracefully, to position their bodies in specific ways, to use their hands, their mouths, their remaining anatomy for purposes that made the younger ones cry and the older ones go silent and dead-eyed. They practiced on each other first. Cleomenes watched, correcting technique, punishing mistakes with a leather strap that left welts for days. The boy learned that nothing belonged to him anymore. Not his body, not his choices, not even his pain. Everything was the temple's property, to be shaped and used as the priests determined. They were never allowed to see women. The priests explained that women would corrupt their purity, distract them from their purpose. The only humans the boys interacted with were other castrated boys, the eunuch instructors, and the priests themselves. This isolation was intentional. It created a world where the priests' demands seemed normal, where resistance seemed impossible, where the boy's only frame of reference was the temple's twisted logic. By age 9, the boy had learned dozens of techniques, positions, methods, ways to endure pain without crying out, ways to fake pleasure when feeling nothing but disgust, ways to dissociate his mind from what was happening to his body. The advanced students, boys who had been there for years, taught the newer ones the survival strategies. Keep your eyes down, never refuse, never complain. If a priest chooses you, consider yourself lucky, because the alternative is worse. The boys who resisted ended up in the lower chambers, the ones beneath the temple where screaming could barely be heard. Some came back broken. Some didn't come back at all. The boy tried to remember his life before the temple. His mother's face, his siblings' names, the feeling of running through fields without pain, without fear, without shame. But those memories faded quickly. The temple consumed everything. There was no past, there was no future, there was only the eternal present of service. Cleomenes introduced a ranking system. The boys competed for status based on appearance, skill, and obedience. Higher-ranked boys received better food, softer beds, fewer beatings. Lower-ranked boys got scraps, slept on stone floors, and faced daily punishment for existing. The competition destroyed any possibility of friendship. Every boy was a rival. Trust was impossible. The worst part wasn't the physical abuse. It was the psychological destruction. The priests convinced the boys that they were privileged, that families paid fortunes to place their sons in the temple, that castration was a blessing, not a mutilation, that learning to please powerful men was an honor, not degradation. Some boys believed it. Their minds broke under the pressure and accepted the lie because the truth was too terrible to survive. The boy turned 10, then 11. His body remained small and soft, frozen in prepubescence by the castration. His voice never deepened, his face never hardened. He remained trapped in a child's body while his mind aged rapidly, contaminated by knowledge no child should possess. What they were preparing him for would make his training seem merciful. The boy was 12 when he learned the real purpose of his training. The temple didn't keep the boys for themselves. They rented them out. Wealthy men from across Greece and beyond paid extraordinary sums for access to the temple's specially trained eunuchs, politicians, generals, merchants, philosophers. They came seeking something they couldn't find elsewhere. Boys who couldn't reproduce, couldn't cause scandals, couldn't make claims of paternity or inheritance. Boys who had been trained since childhood to submit without question, to perform without hesitation, to satisfy desires that even prostitutes refused. The priests called it divine lending. The reality was systematic trafficking wrapped in religious justification. Cleomenes explained the process with his usual unsettling smile. The highest-ranked boys would be presented to potential patrons during special temple ceremonies. The men would inspect them like livestock, check their teeth, examine their skin, test their obedience with degrading commands performed in front of dozens of witnesses. Then, negotiations would begin. Prices varied based on age, appearance, training level, and what the priests called specialization. The boy watched the first auction from the back of the temple hall. An older boy, maybe 15, stood naked on a raised platform while men circled him, touching, commenting, debating his value. The priests recited his qualifications like a merchant selling a horse, trained for 8 years, proficient in 17 specific techniques, never refused a command, particularly skilled at enduring pain without complaint. The winning bid was equivalent to a small estate. The boy who was sold smiled throughout the transaction. A perfect, empty smile that never reached his eyes. He had learned the most important lesson. Resistance made everything worse. Compliance at least meant survival. The boy's turn came 3 months later. They prepared him for days. Ritual baths with perfumed oils, hair removal across his entire body, jewelry placed on his wrists and ankles, makeup applied to his face to enhance his childish features. He was 13 years old and being decorated like a doll for display. The inspection was worse than anything he had experienced during training. Dozens of men, their hands everywhere, their comments clinical and cruel. They discussed his body parts like he couldn't hear them. Too thin. Nice eyes. Skin is acceptable. Has he been tested for endurance? Can he handle multiple sessions? What's his pain threshold? One man, a Roman merchant with rings on every finger, seemed particularly interested. He asked the priests detailed questions about the boy's training, his medical history, his psychological state. The priests answered everything honestly. The boy wasn't a person to them. He was a product with specifications that needed to be accurately advertised. The negotiation lasted an hour. The final price made even the priests look surprised. The merchant wasn't just buying access, he was buying exclusive rights for 6 months. The boy would leave the temple and live in the merchant's household, available whenever desired, forbidden from serving anyone else during that period. The contract was signed. Money changed hands. The boy was handed over like cargo. The merchant's estate was in Corinth, a week's journey from Athens. During the trip, the boy learned his new master's expectations. Total availability, instant obedience, no complaints, no tears, no visible emotion of any kind. The merchant had specific preferences, particular fantasies he wanted enacted. Some involved costumes. Some involved props. Some involved pain levels that made the boy's stomach clench with dread. But here's what the priests never explained. What happened behind closed doors in these private arrangements was worse than anything that happened at the temple. At the temple, there were rules, limits. A boy damaged too severely represented lost profit. In private homes, with no witnesses, no oversight, no consequences, the men could do anything. The merchant's first request broke 3 of the temple's safety protocols. The boy tried to explain this. The merchant laughed and said the temple's rules didn't apply here. He had paid for complete control, complete access, complete freedom to use his purchase however he wished. The boy survived that first night. Barely. His body screamed with pain in places he didn't know could hurt. The merchant seemed pleased. He told the boy this was just the beginning. They had 6 months together. He intended to explore every limit, every boundary, every threshold of endurance the boy possessed. Over the following weeks, the pattern established itself. The merchant used the boy multiple times daily, sometimes alone, sometimes with guests he wanted to impress, sometimes with other boys he had purchased from different sources, forcing them to perform together while he watched. The boy learned a terrible truth. The temple had taught him to endure. But endurance has limits. The human body can only absorb so much damage before it starts to fail. He developed infections, internal injuries that made certain acts excruciating. Psychological breaks where he would dissociate so completely he lost hours of time. The merchant noticed the deterioration but didn't care. He had 6 months prepaid. He intended to use every day he had purchased. 3 months in, the boy tried to escape. He made it 2 miles before the merchant's guards caught him. The punishment for running lasted 3 days. When it ended, the boy couldn't walk. The merchant had to carry him back to the bedroom. He wasn't angry about the escape attempt. He seemed excited by it. The boy's defiance had given him new ideas for games to play. But one client's request would break even the temple's twisted rules. The merchant had a friend, a Roman general named Gaius Petronius. He arrived in Corinth with an entourage of soldiers and a reputation that made even the merchant nervous. Petronius had particular tastes, extreme tastes. He had been banned from several major cities for what he did to the boys he purchased. But wealth and military power provided immunity from consequences. Men like Petronius could do whatever they wanted because no one dared stop them. The merchant offered to share his purchase. Petronius accepted. The first session lasted 18 hours. The boy's screams could be heard throughout the estate. Servants locked themselves in their quarters. Even the guards looked uncomfortable. When morning came, the boy was carried out unconscious, his body covered in marks that would scar permanently. Petronius was delighted. He offered to buy the boy outright, triple the original price. The merchant agreed immediately. Business was business. The boy woke in Petronius's military camp. Dozens of soldiers. No other women or boys. Just him and an army of men who viewed him as communal entertainment. Petronius had rules, though. No one touched his property without permission. The boy belonged to the general. Everyone else just got to watch. Petronius had a specific obsession. He believed that breaking a boy's spirit completely, reducing them to an empty shell incapable of independent thought, was the ultimate achievement. He approached it like a military campaign. Systematic, strategic, relentless. The boy was given impossible commands. Hold this position for hours without moving. Stay silent while being hurt. Smile while experiencing agony. Each failure resulted in escalating punishment. Each success resulted in worse demands. Petronius documented everything. He kept detailed journals describing his experiments, what worked, what didn't, how long it took to achieve specific psychological breaks. The boy was his research subject, his project, his masterpiece in progress. Other boys occasionally appeared in the camp, purchased from various sources. Petronius used them as comparison points. He would subject them to identical treatment and measure who broke faster, who endured longer, who maintained personality versus who became completely hollow. It was methodical torture dressed up as philosophical inquiry. The boy watched others deteriorate. Some became catatonic. Some developed violent outbursts and were killed by guards. Some simply stopped eating and faded away within weeks. The boy survived by becoming exactly what Petronius wanted: empty, obedient, inhuman. But survival came at a cost. The boy's mind fragmented. He developed the ability to separate his consciousness from his body entirely. During the worst sessions, he would float somewhere else, watching from a distance while his body endured things that should have killed him. This dissociation was so complete that even Petronius noticed. He seemed frustrated that his subject had found an escape route. Months passed. The boy's body accumulated damage that wouldn't heal properly. Internal injuries that caused constant pain. Infections that returned repeatedly despite treatment. His appearance changed too. The pretty child Petronius had purchased was becoming gaunt, hollow-eyed, marked by trauma visible to anyone who looked. Petronius grew bored. This always happened. Once a boy was completely broken, the challenge disappeared. The general started discussing his next purchase, debating whether to try a different age range, a different source, a different approach. The boy understood what this meant. Petronius didn't keep used toys. He disposed of them. But the boy had learned something during his time in the camp. He had learned to watch, to listen, to notice patterns in guard rotations, in Petronius's schedule, in the camp's security weaknesses. He had learned that even empty shells could still think, still plan, still want one thing desperately enough to risk everything for it. The boy wanted to die on his own terms, not as Petronius's disposal project, not as another body thrown in an unmarked grave outside the camp. He chose a night when Petronius was hosting other officers, when wine flowed freely and attention was focused on entertainment. The boy slipped away from his usual chamber. He made it to the edge of camp before the alarm sounded. The guards caught him within minutes. They dragged him back to Petronius's tent. The general's face showed something the boy had never seen before. Not anger, curiosity. His perfect subject had exhibited independent action. This was fascinating. Petronius decided to make an example. He called the entire camp to witness. He explained that escape attempts showed the boy still possessed will, still harbored hope, still believed rescue was possible. This needed to be corrected, permanently. What happened next lasted until dawn. Other boys, newly purchased, were forced to watch. Petronius narrated throughout, explaining his methodology, his reasoning, his goals. He was teaching a class using the boy's body as the curriculum. When morning came, the boy was still alive. Barely. Petronius seemed satisfied. He had successfully demonstrated total dominance. The boy was returned to his chamber, but the boy's body was failing. The accumulation of injuries, infections, and trauma had pushed past any threshold of recovery. Petronius called for the camp physician. The doctor examined the boy and delivered his assessment. Multiple internal ruptures, severe infections spreading rapidly, organ damage. Without proper medical intervention, death within days. Petronius asked if intervention was worth the cost. The doctor said no. The boy was too damaged. Even with treatment, he would never return to usable condition. Petronius nodded. Business decisions had to be practical. He had already ordered his next purchase, a younger boy, fresh, undamaged, full of potential. His body was failing, but the temple had one final use for him. Petronius sent the boy back to the temple. Not out of mercy, out of practicality. The contract included a return clause. Damaged goods could be exchanged within the first year. The general wanted his money back. The temple priests accepted the return without question. They had seen this before. Boys came back broken all the time. Some could be rehabilitated and resold. Some couldn't. Either way, the temple had protocols for dealing with used merchandise. They placed the boy in the lower chambers, the ones beneath the main temple where the failures were kept. Dozens of other boys were down there. All returned from various patrons, all damaged beyond repair, all slowly dying from accumulated injuries, infections, and psychological collapse. The lower chambers had no priests, no instructors, no training sessions, just a single elderly eunuch who brought food twice daily and removed bodies when they stopped breathing. He didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, just performed his duties with mechanical efficiency. The boy could barely move. His body was a catalogue of injuries that would never heal, internal damage that caused constant bleeding, infections that had spread into his bones, organs that were failing one by one. But he was still conscious, still aware, still trapped inside a body that was systematically shutting down. He wasn't alone in his suffering. The boy in the next pallet was maybe 14. He had been returned from a politician in Sparta. His spine had been damaged during a session that went too far. He couldn't move anything below his waist. He lay there day after day, staring at the ceiling, waiting for death. Another boy, younger, maybe 11, cried constantly. He had been returned from a merchant who specialized in extreme practices. The boy's mind had shattered. He couldn't speak coherently anymore, just sobbed and occasionally screamed words that made no sense. No one tried to comfort him. Everyone in the lower chambers was too destroyed to help anyone else. The boy learned the truth about the temple's operation. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. This was industrial-scale abuse. The priests castrated dozens of boys every year, trained them, sold them, and when they came back broken, they were stored in the lower chambers until they died. Then their bodies were buried in mass graves beneath the temple complex. No records, no mourning, no acknowledgement they had ever existed. Some boys lasted months in the lower chambers. Some lasted days. It depended on how damaged they were when they arrived. The boy calculated he had maybe 2 weeks before his body gave up completely. The infections were spreading. His fever was constant. He was coughing blood regularly. But something strange happened. An investigation began. A Roman official named Marcus Claudius had lost his nephew to the temple system 5 years earlier. The family had been told the boy died of fever during training. Marcus never believed it. He spent years gathering evidence, interviewing former slaves who had worked at temples, tracking down financial records that proved the trafficking operation. Marcus brought his evidence to the Roman Senate. The testimony was damning. Detailed accounts of the castration procedures, testimonies from merchants who had purchased boys, financial ledgers showing the temple's profits, and most damning of all, a letter from a priest describing the lower chambers and the disposal protocols for boys who didn't survive. The Senate ordered an immediate investigation. Military officials were dispatched to major temples across Greece. The Temple of Aphrodite in Athens was first on the list. The priests tried to prepare. They started destroying records, bribing officials, moving evidence. But they made a critical mistake. They didn't dispose of the boys in the lower chambers fast enough. They assumed the investigation would take weeks to reach them. It took 3 days. When Roman soldiers entered the temple complex, the priests tried to block access to the lower levels. They claimed it was sacred space, forbidden to outsiders, protected by religious law. The military commander ignored them and ordered his men to search every chamber. The discovery of the lower chambers caused several soldiers to vomit. Even men hardened by military campaigns weren't prepared for what they found. Dozens of boys in various stages of dying. Bodies covered in injuries that clearly weren't accidents. The smell of infection and decay so overwhelming that soldiers had to rotate in and out. And the boys themselves, those still conscious, staring with empty eyes that had seen things that destroyed their humanity. The commander ordered immediate medical assistance. Physicians were brought in, but they quickly realized most of the boys couldn't be saved. The damage was too extensive, the infections too advanced. The best they could do was make the dying slightly more comfortable. The boy watched all this happen from his pallet. Roman soldiers moving through the chambers, physicians examining bodies and shaking their heads, the commander shouting orders, his face twisted with rage at what he was witnessing. A physician knelt beside the boy, asked if he could speak. The boy nodded. The physician asked his name. The boy tried to remember. It had been so many years. He couldn't recall. He had been a temple possession for so long he had forgotten he ever had a name. The physician asked what had been done to him. The boy started to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How do you describe years of systematic torture? How do you articulate the complete destruction of childhood, of humanity, of self? The boy's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He had survived so much, but couldn't survive telling the truth about it. The physician examined him. The prognosis was immediate and final. Days at most, possibly hours. The internal damage was catastrophic. There was nothing medical science could do. When authorities finally entered the temple, what they found defied belief. The Roman investigators didn't stop at the lower chambers. They searched the entire temple complex. And beneath the main building, they found something that turned the investigation from a criminal case into a historical atrocity. A mass grave, hundreds of bodies, boys ranging from 7 to 16 years old. Some had been buried recently. Some had been there for decades. All showed signs of the same systematic abuse, castration scars, healed fractures, evidence of malnutrition, trauma to sexual organs indicating prolonged assault. The archaeologist brought in to document the site counted over 300 skeletons in the first excavation area. He estimated there were likely hundreds more in unexplored sections beneath the temple. This wasn't a recent crime. This was an operation that had been running for generations. The priests were arrested immediately. Under interrogation, they confessed to everything, not because they felt guilt. They genuinely didn't understand what they had done wrong. In their minds, they had been providing a religious service. The boys were offerings to the goddess. Their suffering was sacred. Their deaths were part of the natural cycle of temple operations. The head priest, a man named Theophilus, explained the economics calmly. Castrating and training boys was expensive. Selling access to wealthy patrons was profitable. When boys were damaged beyond resale value, keeping them alive was wasteful. Disposal was efficient. The mass grave beneath the temple had been in use for over a century. It was tradition. The Roman officials were horrified. But here's the disturbing part. The Temple of Aphrodite wasn't unique. As the investigation expanded, similar operations were discovered at temples across Greece. Different gods, same system. Thousands of boys castrated, trained, sold, used up, and buried in unmarked graves. The practice had been protected by religious authority, by wealthy patrons who didn't want their activities exposed, and by a society that viewed children from poor families as expendable resources. The temples had operated openly for generations because no one with power cared enough to stop them. The boy died 4 days after the Roman soldiers arrived. He never learned his former name, never saw his family again, never experienced anything resembling justice or healing. He simply stopped breathing in the middle of the night. The physician who had been monitoring him noted the time of death and moved on to the next dying boy. The autopsy was performed by a Greek physician working with the Roman investigators. The findings were documented in excruciating detail. The report became part of the official record of the investigation. The boy's internal organs were described as catastrophically damaged. His intestines showed signs of repeated tearing and infection. His bladder had multiple ruptures that had partially healed and reopened repeatedly. His pelvis showed stress fractures from forced positioning. His spine had compression damage in 3 locations. But the most disturbing finding was in his brain. The physician noted unusual tissue damage in areas associated with memory and emotion. He theorized that extreme psychological trauma had caused physical changes to the brain structure. The boy's mind had been so thoroughly destroyed that it had left visible scars on his neural tissue. The physician concluded his report with a statement that became famous in Roman legal circles. This child's body is evidence of crimes so systematic and prolonged that they represent not individual acts of cruelty, but an institutional dedication to the destruction of human life for profit. The priests were executed. The temples were closed. Laws were passed prohibiting castration of minors across the Roman Empire. But the boys who had already been destroyed couldn't be saved by legislation. The mass graves beneath the temples were excavated over several years. Forensic examination of the remains revealed patterns. Most boys showed signs of castration between ages 7 and 9. Most showed evidence of sustained physical trauma over years. Most died between ages 13 and 16. The average survival time after castration was 6 years. 300 documented bodies at the Temple of Aphrodite alone. Conservative estimates suggested 5,000 boys total across all the temples that participated in the system. 5,000 children castrated, trained, sold, used, and discarded. 5,000 families who sold their sons or had them stolen. 5,000 graves that no one mourned. Modern archaeologists have continued excavating these sites. DNA analysis has provided additional details. Many of the boys were siblings, suggesting families who sold multiple children. Some showed genetic markers indicating they came from specific poverty-stricken regions where child selling was common during famines. The boy who died in the Roman military camp, whose body failed after years of abuse, whose name was forgotten before he could remember it himself, became specimen number 247 in the archaeological record. His skeleton showed all the same damage patterns as the others. He was catalogued, studied, and eventually reburied in a mass ossuary with the other victims. The temple system that destroyed him operated for over 2 centuries before being shut down. 200 years of boys reduced to merchandise. 200 years of suffering protected by religious authority and wealth. 200 years of bodies buried beneath temples while priests counted their profits. The boy never knew his death would contribute to ending the system. Never knew his autopsy would provide evidence that changed Roman law. Never knew he was one of thousands. He died thinking he was alone in his suffering, that his experience was uniquely terrible, that no one else could possibly understand what had been done to him. He was wrong. Hundreds of other boys understood perfectly. They had lived it too. And like him, they had died without justice, without dignity, without even the small mercy of being remembered as human beings rather than as institutional failures. The temple stones still stand in modern Athens. Tourists photograph them daily. They read plaques about ancient religious practices and architectural significance. The mass graves beneath have been sealed. The archaeological reports are stored in academic archives. The boy's skeleton rests in an ossuary with numbers instead of names. History remembers the temples. History forgets the boys who were ground into dust to build them.